Thank you. I really like to be here and to talk about paper, of course. And now I have to start with a personal story. I was 11 years old. I went to watch a movie, and in the movie there was a butler who pulled out his cuff and wrote down a note. I love it. I went home and I ruined 2 shirts until my grandmother caught me and she said, you know, come to my chest of drawer. She pulled out, had a box. Inside of the box there was a bunch of cuffs and collar of my grandfather. And she showed me one where there was, Ti amo Rosina, I love you, Rosina, that he wrote probably when they were engaged. And she showed me that the cuff was in paper. And I was completely surprised about that because I didn't realize how really paper is all around us. We are talking always paper as the support where you write, but paper is really a dominant part to the point, for instance, in 1870, one Boston manufacturer was producing 75,000 cuffs. So it was really an amazing discovery. There was a song in London in 1860 where the refrain was, oops, too fast. For paper now is all the rage and nothing else will suit the age. And it was sung by this man, Howard Paul, and he was all dressed in paper. It doesn't look from the drawing, but I guess it was. Now, Clifford Pickard, in answering to a request made by an English newspaper, he is a staff member of the IBM Watson Research Center. And he was asked what was the most famous invention. He said it was the Chinese invention of paper. And he compared the paper to the internet, because in reality, paper and the internet break the barriers of time and distance. And really, architecture came in the age of paper in 14th century. Basically, the paper was invented by the Chinese, moved along the Silk route down to the Arabs. There is an 11th century treatise in Arab that says, the writing base of scribes, instrument of their intelligence. And it was, how do you make paper? So paper came, of course, from the Arabs came up to Europe, and in the beginning, paper was really considered bad, in the sense that the church was forbidding to write the word of God on paper, because paper was a pagan art, couldn't be used for the sacred word. But slowly, the paper landed on the table of the architect. And I think paper played a major role in the transformation of architecture. And you can see, for instance, this painting of Lotto, where there is an architect. And of course, it's holding up a compass, and with the index is really touching on the top of paper. Unfortunately, there's been a slow misunderstanding of the nature of paper in relationship of architecture. And that is being caused by 2 lines. On one side, the profession, on the other side, Cartesian thinking. And the profession is very easy. I was quite surprised when I came to the States, and I learned that the yellow light tracing paper, using an assonance, is called trash. Then I learned another word, and of course, I didn't know what it meant, bumwad. And then I was told, don't use that in front of clients. But if you go on the internet and you punch bumwad, you get that picture. And they sell it with the name. Huh? And basically what happened is paper became something that doesn't have value. Of course, there is exception. People can use tracing paper properly, like Venturi in this case, but Paper, because of the way the profession built the client, and because of the card saying that an image is like a little bit of ink that was through here and there on paper. So basically, he invented the inkjet. That paper doesn't have an interaction with what you are designing. So the work of paper becomes completely separate. And in 1994, when there was the invention of the so-called paperless studio, that was this pushing out of paper, the negative factor of the profession, and moving from the analog to the digital mode was this way of breaking the condition and pushing for the environment. But in reality, to understand what's going on in paper, we have to go a little bit back in time and use this distich, which was brought for analyzing the text in medieval time. And it says, litera gesta docet, qui credas allegoria, moralis, qui agas, quotendas anagogia. And basically is the four senses of a literary text: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogic. Now, a drawing really has these four conditions. It's literal, because it's telling you the envelope of the building. Allegorical, because we have to rely on this kind of modification of representation of the image. It has to be moral, because it has to respect, just in a very simple way, the building code. And what is pointing is the anagogical. Now, when we transfer the idea from analogical to digital, we lose anagogia. And that, I think, is the key issue, that we should really be able to understand how anagogy is in the drawing or on the paper. Now, to try to understand a little bit better what anagogy means, I have to do a little bit of etymology. Anagogy comes from the Greek and is the combination of two words, ana, above, high, and agein, to lead. The proper Latin translation, which was done immediately, was sursum ductio. And in that way, you can use it in Isidore of Seville, Venerable Bede, Rabanus Maurus. But slowly, the word anagogia came out, and really, in architectural drawing, the literal, the allegorical sense refers strictly to analogical construct that speak to the tectonic and formal imagination. And of course, they are didascalic in that sense. The tropological sense, which is the moral sense, speaks to the intellect, free from the imagination. But what is the most important is anagogia, which really speaks to the telos of that drawing, demonstrating that basically the future is in front of the past. And it's very important to understand, especially in the distich, that anagogia is the last one. There is many ways that has been memorized for teaching, but there is always this condition. Anagogy is the last one. So it is in this formal and qualitative condition that architecture got to anagogy. Of course, we know architecture started paperless. You know, to call it a paperless studio was nothing new. This, for instance, is the story that I copied from a book about how people went to build a paperless building. One went to the site, marked with pegs, and then looking where the woods was, where the city was, where the river was, he made all the connections necessary to build the building. And that was the first step. Then the second step was the use of tracing floor. There was drawing, but this drawing took place on site, and they were in large dimension. They belonged to the building, and the operation was there. Now, of course, the next step is the analogical step, and it's beautifully described by Cesare Cesariano. The test is really on the other side when he shows the iconografia, that is the plan of the cathedral, Milan Cathedral, and he says, iconografia is an impression made over the ground or on dust, and that is referring to the traditional abacus, which was a tray full of sand. This one is my favorite, on pasta. I can imagine the guy rolling the pasta and to have a large sheet and working each step on that, or on snow, as I draw on the paper. And that is done with steps and leaving print. And then, of course, the game becomes that this operation on paper is done with two things. The compass, and that is clearly analogical. The leg of the compass becomes the leg of the architect on site. And with the litus, which is the device that the Roman augur used to figure out the templum. And the litus is this device, the temple is something that was in the sky, not on the ground. So you had to draw with this stick of wood, which was supposed not to burn, the 4 division, waiting for the flight of birds, and then was the projection down on the ground done by crossing 2 lines. And that is basically what he calls the sketch. Of course, I have to jump a little bit in the story. Oops. Because otherwise I will go on and hours and hours. So I have to move from Cesariano, and I move to Vincenzo Scamozzi, which has a very long chapter where he says, he had been asked too many times how he prepared paper. So he goes down in this very complicated description of how he prepares paper, how he make it very nice with using sheet one on top of the other, pushing, pulling, making the surface completely in support of the paper. But of course, he does exactly the same operation. He talks about tracing the cross on the paper. But in this case, paper becomes also another tool. It's not only the support, but it takes a piece of paper, folds it in 4, and it becomes a square. So it's using these 2 lines, and the paper itself on top of paper is performing this transformation of the design. So there is this change of the material. It's not a support anymore, but become an active part of the game. I just changed the computer, and I don't know where at the bottom. Now, I have to talk about ink, because through ink, we understand something peculiar, because all the description of Scamozzi about how you draw on paper, he says, you groove it, you run ink on top of that, which are the normal understanding of how we think about the use of paper. But then he has a completely different understanding of it. And it comes through when he talks about how do you make ink. So he says you get your gall, you put the dam, of course, has to be Romanian wine because it's very dry, and the gall is from Istria. Then you put it in a big jar, and you put it in the sun for 30 days, which, by the way, is the same technique to prepare nocino. You take a big jar, you fill it up with nuts, you put it 30 days in the sun, and you get your nocino. And he says that this is a very good ink because it works beautifully on the surface. Now, toward the end, he says that the ink has to be prepared, modified, and adjusted. Oops, sorry. is the color that is coming up. And he says, from a purple hue, it washes, which gives elegance to the drawing. And from the fact that the slight markings appearing in the back of the paper are the same color. So what he's thinking about is the percolating of the ink through the paper. And there is this drawing. Of course, what it does, there is the percolating, and when the ink goes through, you can draw on the other side. So paper takes a completely different nature because of these percolating qualities. By the way, the drawing is here in the archives, if you want to see it. It's really the power of the paper that allows another understanding of the surface. Now, let's move to carta da lucido, which is the tracing paper, heavy tracing paper. Now, carta da lucido was there from the beginning. Cennino Cennini described how to make carta da lucido. He says you take the paper, you take linseed oil, you run on top of that, it becomes transparent, and you can work. Now, the problem with that was it was very greasy, and it doesn't work. Sure, you could do a few things, but you couldn't use it in the architectural field. You had to wait until basically 1850, 1860, that finally someone comes up with a patent and is able to make good tracing paper. And of course, there is the great invention of the drawing on tracing paper and the possibility of reproducing the image by using a diazo machine. Now, by the way, in Washington, D.C. right now doesn't exist anymore any, in Italian we call it heliografica. They don't exist anymore, they are gone. And this obsolete machine made a different relationship between the papers. And I want to use these two cases. What happened is when there was the invention of the tracing paper, the architect prepared, and I'm going to use the Italian terminology because I like it more, sottolucido. And then someone was going to draw on top, which was the lucido. In drawing in the lucido, you lost the anagogic dimension of the drawing. That one on top is Carlo Scarpa, which is the sottolucido, has been conceived as a sottolucido, by which a second person will sit on top, understanding all the notation that are around, it will prepare the piece of lucido to be printed and then sent for production. Now, in this sense is the four senses are in the drawing, but the anagogic is lost when it's transferred. The one on the bottom is by Louis Kahn, and this is exactly the opposite mode. Some draftsman prepared the drawing, and he put a piece of yellow tracing paper on top, and he pulled out the anagogic sense. So there was the three senses, the literal, the moral, and the allegorical are left in the sottolucido. And the anagogic comes only in the lucido, performed in charcoal and in drawing. So basically, paper is this amazing device that if we are going to transfer our understanding in the digital world, means not only that we have to understand how the phenomenon of paper was related to the analogical realm, but how the anagogical condition is there, by which it becomes very difficult to know if the architecture is in the stone, in the paper, or in the internet. But the key question is, what is that meaning that we can use behind the line? Thank you.